This week, we're focusing in on how the West controls what sometimes some people call the developing nations, but I find that quite an unattractive label, bearing in mind that the idea of them wanting to develop anything like many Western countries have turned into is probably something that would push them to a 180-degree turn. But what we're going to focus primarily upon is how the control takes place in relation to the economy, in terms of trade, in terms of politics. So actually the West desires poverty. It desires poverty on quite a large scale, so that it becomes the mother to the little child, and the little child is constantly want to suck on the teat. Over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So I'm going to start just briefly by giving people a sort of summary of the state of poverty worldwide, and then I'm going to explain the main ways in which the poverty is reinforced by advanced nations. So the world's population at the moment is just under 8 billion people. Now, of those, approximately half don't have safe sanitation. And then approximately a quarter, so just over 2 billion people, do not have access to safe drinking water. And then if we look at other data, there's just under 1 billion who suffer from what we call chronic undernourishment. That means on a long-term basis, they don't get adequate nutrition. And so many of those people, particularly children, suffer from stunted growth. And then each year, it's estimated that there are approximately 6 million children and many millions of adults who die of easily preventable diseases, and about 9 million people die of hunger each year. And I don't want to get too graphic with the details, but it's estimated that there are probably about 40 million slaves in the world and about 150 million children involved in child labor. And when families can't earn enough money to survive, then they will resort to selling cocaine, heroin, sex, blood, and even organs in the most extreme cases. So poverty is an enormous global problem, and it's really not talked about very much in the mainstream media. And one of the things that's become apparent from economists who study these things is that since approximately 1960, the income gap between rich countries and poor has approximately tripled. So quite a lot, if you listen to a government official, they'll always say, oh, we give a little bit of aid, we're doing our best to help poor countries. It's true that we give a little bit of aid, and we'll talk about that, the myths relating to aid in a future session, but they're not actually doing anything to reduce poverty in poor countries. And what is very sad about much of these things is that in many cases, the solutions are incredibly simple. So, for example, lots of children die all over the world just from diarrhea. And yet you can treat that very easily with a combination of salt, sugar, and water. And it would cost close to nothing in the grand scheme of things. So there's plenty of food in the world, but it's not properly distributed. So what we realize is that poverty and inequality should really be described as the real weapons of mass destruction. So I'm going to talk about how that comes about. So in 2002, a senior insider from the World Bank, the former chief economist of the World Bank, his name was Joseph Stiglitz, he wrote a landmark book called Globalization and Its Discontents. Now, he wasn't saying anything that hadn't been said by many other people before, but the people who'd been saying it previously were outsiders, people like me, right? And nobody takes any notice of us. Nobody with power takes any notice of us. So for the first time, a very, very senior insider, somebody who was actually a senior advisor to the United States government, was coming forward and saying, listen, the system that we impose on poor countries, it doesn't work. And in fact, he was going further than that. He was saying it cannot work and it's not intended to work. So we're going to talk about that system. So often people talk about it using the expression shock therapy. It's a series of economic policies that are forced on poor countries very rapidly. I call it bloodsucker capitalism. Some academics call it neoliberalism, but it's all much the same sort of thing. The focus is on the rights of rich people to make lots of money, the rights of big companies to make lots of money, irrespective of the downsides to everybody else. And various economists, so most notably in Britain, there's a very good economist at Cambridge called Ha-Joon Chang, as well as being an academic. He writes popular books for the public. And he's pointed out that these policies that we force on poor countries are very different from the policies that have been used by advanced nations to become advanced nations throughout history. So we'll look at the three main sets of policies. So firstly, there's austerity. Now, most people will have heard the term because it's now been applied in advanced nations for the last few years. So this means lower spending by governments. Now, in poor countries, this often means sacking teachers, sacking doctors and nurses, cutting wages, and ending subsidies to the poorest people. So in many poor countries, governments help with the cost of food. Well, if you cut the subsidies to pay for that food, then the nutritional standards of people's diets decreases. So austerity has serious negative consequences. The second set of policies is known as privatization. So that is where you take part of the economy that's owned by the state. So that can be the water supply, the healthcare system, energy systems and electricity and so on. And you hand it over or you sell it at a very low cost to a private company who then runs it for the benefit of their shareholders and to make profit rather than running it for the benefit of society. Now, it's very important to understand that this has been researched over and over again. And the people who support these policies often say, well, we think it's more efficient if it's owned by private companies who are striving for bigger profits. But in fact, there is no evidence of that. Overwhelmingly, what we see is the profit motive leads these companies to do what you or I might call really bizarre things. So, for example, if you privatize the water supply, the first thing a private company does is to cut off the poorest people from the water supply because they know there's no profit to be made by supplying those people with water. And in fact, there was a very famous incident in about the year 2000 in Bolivia where an American company called Bechtel took over the water supply of Bolivia. Eventually, there were so many protests from the Bolivian people that the government had to back down and Bechtel were forced out of the country. So it's recognized throughout the poorest countries that this privatization is intended to enrich the rich. It is not about making anything work better. And when the water supply was privatized in South Africa, the supply to the poorest people was cut off, and they had outbreaks of cholera, which they had not seen for many years. So diseases become more widespread if you can't get readily available clean water. And it's been found that in the poorest countries, some incredibly poor families would sooner walk for 4 hours a day to get water rather than having to pay for it. So the general sort of policy advice from people who are trying to help these countries develop is actually it makes sense to provide free water to the poorest people. And then the final set of policies that I'm going to talk about, and this is probably going to be the main focus today, is what's called liberalization. So that means free trade. It's about getting rid of as many rules as possible for companies that want to trade in other countries. And it's not just about removing controls on businesses, it's also about removing controls on the movement of money. We've talked a little bit about how money flying in and out of a country can completely destabilize the economy, and we talked about that last week. When researching this, I came across a great quote by the former executive director of the World Bank, a guy called Morris Miller. And he said, "Not since the conquistadors plundered Latin America has the world experienced a flow of wealth from poor countries to rich in the direction we see today." And that, again, is a senior insider saying that the system is transferring huge amounts of wealth. The best estimate is about $2 trillion a year from poor countries to rich. And this economic exploitation is led by the US and Europe and Britain and other advanced nations who all recognize that the richest people in their countries will benefit from these policies. So it's important to understand what the term free trade means. And I usually try to explain it by saying the opposite of free trade is properly regulated trade. So occasionally you'll hear people in the news or even academics who give a presentation about the joys of free trade where they're suggesting that the opposite of free trade is no trade. And in fact, nobody's in favor of no trade. Everybody's in favor of trade, but you've got to do it correctly. And free trade is about not regulating it correctly. So if you had proper regulation of companies, then you regulate the use of poisonous chemicals, you regulate employment standards, you regulate pollution, and so on. Whereas what companies want is none of those things. So companies are always pushing for more deregulation. So I often think that a proper term for what currently is free trade would be forced trade, where poor countries are forced to trade in a way that doesn't work for them. Now, the Cambridge economist I was talking about earlier, Ha-Joon Chang, gives a wonderful example of how advanced nations have developed without using these policies. So if we look at, say, Japan in the post-Second World War II period, they protected developing industries. Most famously, they protected the car company Toyota. Now, if they had been forced to open up to competition from American and European car manufacturers early on, Toyota would have gone out of business pretty much overnight because its products were just not as technically sophisticated as products from overseas. But because the Japanese government was allowed to protect them, Toyota has evolved over about half a century to become probably the leading car company in the world. So the advanced nations keep trying to say to poor countries, hey, you've got to end all this protection. Often they'll use technical terms like subsidies and tariffs. We want you to end all of those things. But in fact, advanced nations have used those things in the past, and many of them are still using them today to help industries that they believe they need to help. And if you look at the countries that have developed most successfully over the last 3/4 of a century since the end of World War II, countries like Taiwan and South Korea, their progress has been absolutely spectacular. And they were allowed not to pursue the policies that we're talking about. So they didn't have to do shock therapy. So it's important to understand a point that we made last week when we were saying that you can't have a free market when you start with extreme inequality. So the same happens with free trade. There is no such thing as a level playing field in international trade. The big companies backed by the governments of rich countries always have enormous advantages. And what happens is that once Western companies are allowed to sell their goods in poor countries, that destroys native industries. So we've actually seen over the last half a century a process of deindustrialization in the poorest countries. And there've been lots and lots of case studies on this. So when Jamaica opened up to overseas imports, its milk production was completely destroyed. When Haiti opened up, its rice and poultry production was completely destroyed. And in fact, this idea of dependency on US food exports is actually a deliberate part of US foreign policy. So it is actively trying to destroy the food production systems of other countries. So those countries are not self-sufficient in their food production. What we see when this is applied over and over again is that many people lose their jobs. There's a case study on the Ivory Coast where the chemical, textiles, automobile and shoe industries all collapsed. And when I say collapsed, it happens almost overnight. Once foreign imports are allowed in, these companies go out of business because they cannot yet compete. In Nigeria, there was a famous study where 35 huge textile mills closed after foreign imports were allowed in. And it was estimated that about 200,000 people lost their jobs. And the best writer on this subject is a critical writer called Michael Chossudovsky. And he's written an outstanding book, which is one of a tiny handful that I recommend to anybody who really wants to start understanding these things in more depth. And his book was called The Globalization of poverty. And he goes into great detail of a case study with Russia. So you have to remember, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Soviet Union fell apart. And then Russia, under a sort of Western oriented leader, tried to impose this shock therapy. And it was a huge disaster. So the price of bread and other basic essentials went through the roof, so ordinary people couldn't afford them. And it's estimated that 70 million people in Russia plummeted into poverty. And they had a decrease in their life expectancy, which has never been seen before outside of wartime. So it was absolutely devastating. At the same time, some older people will remember that the news was often talking about the Russian oligarchs. So these were senior people who had connections in the Russian government, and they became billionaires almost overnight by being allowed to take control of state industries such as oil and gas and so on. Now, there was a development economist called Jeffrey Sachs. People may have heard of him. He often writes and gets interviewed in the mainstream press. And he was one of the economists who advised Russia on their policies throughout the 1990s when these disasters were happening. And he did an interview on a TV program called BBC Hard Talk some years later. And he said he realized with hindsight that these policies were not about helping Russia to develop. They were actually about finishing off the Cold War. And that was an amazing admission by somebody who had been very important in implementing these disastrous policies, that he did eventually admit that the policies were essentially about destroying the country. And so what happens over and over again is that American companies and European and British and other companies from advanced nations gain control of existing assets in those countries and make very large profits from them. And there's case study after case study in Peru, Mexico, and so on. So for anyone who's interested, that book is well worth a look. So it's interesting to look at an academic textbook when they're talking about things like free trade. And they do all sorts of complex analysis, all very theoretical, with no real discussion of the things that I've just talked about the downsides. And what they say is that in theory, free trade is meant to be win-win. Poor countries will win and rich countries will win, and everybody will develop happily together. And in fact, this has nothing to do with what's going on either politically or in practice economically. So if you have a look at a free trade agreement, I don't recommend it because they're thousands of pages long and they're written in technical legalese and so on. But free trade agreements are not really about free trade. They're about more rights and more power for investors. So free trade policies tend to have the following real purposes. So there's about 5 that I'm just going to suggest. Firstly, they allow investors to move money freely both in and out of the country. They allow investors and companies to set up complex international structures, so with holding companies, subsidiaries all over the place to manipulate prices and profits. They allow companies from advanced nations to extract raw materials in other countries on unfair terms. And so in later sessions, we will talk a little bit about industries that have actually had some media coverage, such as cotton production and coffee production, where the terms of trade are incredibly unfair. And we in advanced nations do not pay a reasonable price for these basic essentials. The free trade rules also enable companies from advanced nations to sell in other countries, eliminating local production, and they enable companies from advanced nations to access cheap labor at incredibly low pay rates in poor countries. So it's important to understand that properly regulated trade works really well. So this means don't do austerity, don't do privatization, don't deregulate, do the things that advanced nations have done throughout their lives, where they support industries, they protect industries. There's a powerful relationship between government and businesses, but the government also provides safety nets to help the poorest people. It provides subsidies where necessary and so on. So if you look at the countries that have developed most spectacularly since 1945, the obvious ones would be South Korea and Taiwan, which I've mentioned, Japan, Israel, and then two sort of island city-states, Hong Kong and Singapore, and more recently China. None of them have done the policies that we've listed today, that we've talked about today, which are the ones forced upon most developing countries with causing great harm. So many poor countries could probably end poverty quite quickly if they were left to their own devices. And this is something that people don't seem to recognize, particularly economists at university, that if you leave a government to its own devices and its policies are focused on ending poverty, getting people off the lowest rung of poverty, so providing a basic education, a basic healthcare system, adequate food, sanitation, water, and so on, any government, even the poorest governments, are capable of doing that. And we can see that in a country like Cuba, or in the Indian state of Kerala, which is also a communist state, and then also countries such as Iraq and Libya, which were very socialist countries, they actually managed to increase the quality of life and get people out of poverty quite easily without being particularly wealthy. And of course, what we've seen since 2008 and the financial crisis is that many advanced nations are now doing the same policies. We've had austerity in Britain for a decade. We're seeing the slow, steady privatization of the NHS, which, as I perhaps have mentioned before, it's not about efficiency. There is no serious analyst of healthcare systems who believes that a private system works better than a state-run system. There just isn't any evidence to support that. It's about allowing very rich, powerful people with connections to the government to extract wealth from the system. And we're seeing millions of people in Britain and tens of millions in America queuing at food banks. And these policies are not accidental. They're deliberate policies by rich and powerful people, both domestically and internationally. And in fact, even organizations like the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, which is one of the organizations we'll talk about in another session, who enforce these policies, they have actually admitted there is no evidence to support a policy of austerity. It just doesn't work to achieve anything. It's actually detrimental for those countries who apply it. So one of the things you start to realize when you're analyzing poverty is that most people who study poverty, they study poor people. But actually, if you want to understand poverty, you have to stop doing that, and you have to study what rich people do and powerful people do, because it's the rich and the powerful in any government who determine the policies of that nation. And it's the rich and the powerful who negotiate internationally to determine the global trade rules. And the rich and the powerful in country after country are enforcing policies that are intended to enrich themselves, but are often very, very harmful to large swathes of the population. Now, if you look at media coverage of these issues, always the media will blame a foreign government for poverty within its borders. But in fact, it completely ignores the role of advanced nations in manipulating these international policies. And so we have situations where a foreign government might want to do much better policies, and Britain and America will invade and overthrow the government. Or on a less extreme note, where other governments have tried to do better policies, Britain and America and other advanced nations will apply sanctions. They'll put pressure on the government. With the case of Venezuela, we've actually stolen their gold. And so there's all these different measures that can be used by advanced nations to put pressure on governments who will not enforce policy. And the CIA regularly destabilizes countries and governments that are trying to do better policies in order to try and get a right-wing dictator, often a mass murdering dictator, into power, who will enforce these policies to make American and British and European companies very rich. And then just one sort of final point that I think is worth mentioning. If you actually look at what middle-class people in poor countries do and think, and the way they behave, they actually like these policies. If they're in the sort of upper middle-class bracket, they like the policies because it allows them to buy Western consumer goods. They want Western TVs, Western fridges, computers, phones, and so on. They like these policies that allow these goods to be imported, and they don't care about the fact that the white goods industry in their home country has basically been destroyed. It either never existed because nobody's invested to develop it in the first place, or it was developing and it got destroyed because it couldn't compete with the advanced products from advanced nations. So you see that rich and middle class people in many poor countries, they don't want to examine these policies critically because the policies work for them. And oddly enough, my wife comes from India, and so I have some experience talking to middle class people in India. They actually like the fact that they are surrounded by poverty, because they like having an army of servants who are paid very, very little, almost like a sort of surplus army of slave labor to do the basic menial tasks for them. So there's no real pressure in these countries from the middle class to actually implement better policies. Okay, I think that's probably a good time to stop that presentation and open up for a Q&A and a debate.
Fabulous, Rod. Thank you so much. So much there. I'm going to start at the end.
Yeah.
Start at the end. And you talked about, obviously, your wife and the middle class in India like being surrounded by people that they can rip off, exploit, use for their own ends. Does that in some way also have something to do with the caste system?
I'm sure in India it does. So not so much in other countries.
No, of course.
But very much in India. They still take the caste system seriously at an individual level. So if you look at what the government's been trying to do over the last few years, it's been trying to minimize the effect of the caste system. But these things take many, many years to overcome. It was ingrained in their society for generations. And so as with many of the things we talk about, you kind of have to wait till one generation dies off. And then you get the new generation that's come through where the policies have been different, to when they become policymakers themselves, then the mindset changes and the discussion changes. So, but it is still the case that there is a lot of what you might call ego tied up in the caste system, and people in the castes that are considered to be higher castes are very proud of that. And they do definitely look down upon people that they consider to be lower caste.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. To be honest, it's so difficult to know where to start. But I'm going to start here. You talked about the successful countries, and you talked about, you gave examples of Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, South Korea. And we used it as an example, if you like, of countries that didn't adopt the Western model that they imposed upon poor countries. My argument would be, though, that alongside that, they also depended very much upon exploitation. So they got where they were using a capitalist model, which effectively meant that the true cost of the individual labor was never paid to the individual. And a lot of it was pulled back by the state or by corporations, very, very rich people. So in effect, by implementing that model and creating, let's remember, in these individuals, huge debt and huge expectations, they were still very much dumped upon from above.
You may be right, actually. I'd have to do a lot of research to sort of check that out. So I think I've actually chatted to people, particularly from South Korea, and they've always had this view, and this relates to both the economic things that you're talking about, but also about democracy, that they always felt that provided the general standard of living was rising rapidly, which appears to have been the case in all of these countries. So it started off from a very, very low base, way behind many African countries years ago, and it sort of accelerated past them. That provided the general standard of living was increasing, then they didn't mind too much about either exactly how the economy was structured or about how governments did democracy or didn't do democracy, because for much of their development they were not democracies. So I'd have to do some research to find out exactly the extent to which some portion of the population was exploited and so on. There's a separate issue that was highlighted by a researcher at the LSE in London called Robert Wade. And when I was originally researching the problems of US and British foreign policy in relation to development, I was focusing on the negatives. But in fact, if we look at the half dozen countries that I've listed as being spectacular success stories, in fact, it becomes very clear that all of those countries were really important to America for what are called geostrategic reasons. So Taiwan is a kind of off an island near China, where a possible future government of China had sort of fled and was protected by the Americans and so on. So it had an important political role. And then South Korea similarly was the bottom half of Korea, which was split into North Korea and South Korea following the Korean War in the 1950s and so on. So these countries that developed well, America and Britain and other advanced nations were actively supporting them in helping them develop rapidly. And so, in fact, their economies became directly connected to the economies of advanced nations. And so my recollection when I was growing up is I would have an Action Man toy and I'd be aware it said made in Taiwan on the back. And actually, advanced nations were using Taiwan at that stage as a producer of certain types of goods, which benefited us, but it also benefited the development of Taiwan, because it was allowed to develop in a particular way where certain industries were protected and encouraged and so on. So Robert Wade was pointing out that there is this kind of additional layer, which is entirely different from normal economic theory, which is about advanced nations helping a small number of countries to develop because it's useful to them politically. But what I think we can learn from this is that actually to get poor countries out of poverty is probably not that hard. In fact, to make them first world nations, if that's what they'd like to be, advanced industrialized economies, is not that hard if we choose to help them develop the way they want to develop. The reason most other countries have found it so hard is we have fought so hard to hold them back.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I have a massive issue with the word successful, because it's not an objective term. It's very much a subjective term.
It's not an objective term.
And it's also very much related to economics. And if we take Hong Kong, for example, it's basically seen as the warehouse of criminality on the planet. It's this sort of, in terms of drugs, in terms of pretty much whatever you want. And so many people are almost expected to ignore the law, and they just play lip service occasionally and hold somebody up and say, look, we are doing our job properly where we find these people. But most of the time there's backhanders, there's turning blind eyes, there's very powerful people who are basically walking around literally killing people. You look at Singapore, for example, it's almost a fascist regime in terms of the way in which they use draconian criminal justice policies in order to publicly whip people who even dare to graffiti in an outside public place or whatever. So we must look at the word successful from a distance and say, well, that's not my kind of success, to be fair. And as I said before, can I just say as well, Rod, as well, the point I made earlier, when we talk about success, we usually talk about, yes, cost of living. Okay, so not the cost of living, so the state of the way in which people live their lives. But I would also argue that transfers a lot in terms of individual debt. So the individuals then basically are stuck in this cage of debt for most of their life, where their behavior is largely conditioned by it. And also the very, very dramatic effect, as we've seen with China and India and other countries in terms of climate change, whereas it might be successful from a certain privileged position, it's actually murdering the planet.
So I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a much bigger debate to be had. And one day we should invite lots of kind of other people on who are interested in discussing these things, where we do question what is progress? What does it mean to be an advanced nation? So when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about in quite a narrow term that fits in with sort of mainstream discussions. But I absolutely accept that you're correct, that we really do need to question all of these concepts and not buy into the notion that there's only a single type of development or a single type of advanced nation, and so on. So from the point of view of today's presentation, actually, if we just think in terms of not worrying about whether a country has a broad industrial base or anything like that, but just simply in terms of getting the world's population off the lowest rung of poverty. And that, to me, would be such a simple task if only advanced nations wanted that to be a policy goal. But unfortunately, it's not.
And that comes back to this whole idea of exploitation, because if you want to create all these widescreen televisions, you want to create all these white goods and all these whatever, these materialist cultures now almost imposing upon you, and you want to buy them at a cost that you can afford, you need millions, probably no billions of people who are prepared or not prepared, who are being forced to work in conditions that enable these white goods, etc., to be created. So it's not like, it's not like a level playing field where we're all saying, okay, we're going to barter, we're going to distribute evenly. This is a process by which a small minority of the world's population is sucking up for their own individual egos, their own individual ends, so they can sit there at night and watch a 47-inch flat screen TV with a skybox, or they can have that flashy car in the drive, or they can do wear all these flashy clothes or whatever. They can do all these things, and yet they give very little, if any, attention to where it came from.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And oddly enough, I think in quite complex ways that the discussion will gradually change when it gets to the point where a great deal of the production, say, of a television is automated by robots and so on. And we're getting quite close to that position now where that becomes possible. But in fact, all that will happen there is that billions more people will have no system of employment at all. And we will have to completely question the way we structure the whole sort of economy. So it raises a whole range of sort of questions where we cannot sort of know what the answers will be in the future.
I suspect, though, it also will see, and we are seeing, a shift in terms of the way in which production processes work. Because in order to create these flat screen televisions or whatever, or mobile phones, you still need precious metals to be mined. You still need them to be extracted from the ground, and then you still need them to be constructed in such a way as that they become usable within whatever technical gadget you have. So yes, there will be redundancy of people, but there'll also be there's going to have to be a shift away from people working in factories and putting them actually in much more precarious positions. So ironically, the robots will probably, they won't need any health and safety because they're robots, but their environment would also mean that they probably wouldn't need any health and safety if they had any ability to intelligent interaction. Whereas a lot of humans would be increasingly shifted towards places where their life expectancy or the losing of a limb will become, the lower life expectancy and the losing of a limb will become fairly normalized again. So we're almost retreating back towards the 17th, 18th, 19th century.
Well, I think it's interesting you should say that. So I often think that if you look at the distribution of wealth in advanced nations and the levels of inequality that we're already seeing here, that we are rapidly heading back to earlier centuries, where we do have this sort of massive underclass who are finding it harder and harder to earn a reasonable living. Yes,
absolutely. I want to talk about the idea in terms of, you use the term rationalization, and then the nature of rationalization, obviously from a capitalist perspective, is around this efficiency. But actually, in terms of a corresponding democracy that works alongside this economic ideology, The only way you can be rational is if you have access to all of the information. Then once you've taken on board the access to all this information, and you've consumed it and you've analyzed it and you evaluate it, are you then able to make a rational decision? So for us to call something rational requires access, and it also requires the skills and the capabilities to make sense of the information that you're interacting with. Otherwise, it's always going to be irrational because you're only seeing part of the picture.
I'm really sorry. When you use the term rationalization, were you talking about privatization? So I tend not to use the term rationalization.
No,
I'm not quite sure what.
No, fair enough. No, absolutely. It links very much to liberalization. It links to privatization. This idea that the individual has the rational capability so that the state becomes smaller, the individual takes on much more responsibility for their decision making. But my argument is that where those ideologies have been imposed, the Taiwans, the Singapores, increasingly in China, the Hong Kongs, the Israels, or whatever, my argument is it simply is a fallacy. It's completely bunk. And the reason it is because they're not given the information that they require in order to make those decisions. It's imposed upon them still by the state, still by corporations, through sound bites, through advertising, through propaganda. So actually, the individual is making a whole number of irrational decisions, which therefore leads to irrational outcomes, which creates more chaos.
So you've sort of entered onto a very big area. Actually, we need a whole of the show to do this sort of really justice. So the question is kind of about you're questioning the kind of logic rationale that underpins mainstream economics teaching, which is that we're all logical or rational profit maximizers. And whilst that sounds good in a textbook, it's contradicted by all the evidence.
Absolutely.
That exists in the real world, that humans don't actually work like that. We're not robots, we're not computers. A great deal of our decision making is based on our feelings, our emotions, and so on. And that our brains just don't really function in this way. Oddly enough, there's always this joke that the only people who do think that way are economists and psychopaths, and ordinary people just don't think this way. And so we can never really have all the information necessary to make complex decisions. If you imagine going shopping and trying to be a robotic sort of optimizer in terms of your decision making, you would be sitting there reading the list of ingredients on every item that you put in your trolley. You'd be looking at the price of everything per 100 grams and doing complex calculations and blah blah blah. And that's in simple situations where you can see all the prices. And companies go out of their way to make the real world much more complex. And if you're, say, choosing a school for your children and you have to make some decisions, there are no kind of measurements that you can easily trade off against each other. There's lots of qualitative factors, and actually the world is much less quantitative and much more qualitative, much more subjective about what you believe than economists want to admit. So you're absolutely right. It is complete nonsense.
Yeah, and do you think that's also because economists tend to deal with the mathematical a lot more and much less so with the social?
Yes, and I think that's a point worth making. And in fact, we sort of hinted at it a couple of weeks ago, where we were saying that 130 years ago, probably, you'd say that all the major economists would talk about something that's much closer to what I would call political economy, the relationship between powerful players in the economy and political decision makers and so on. And unfortunately, very, very sort of gradually, particularly over the last 40 years, economics has become much more about the maths side of things. And in fact, the author I mentioned earlier, Ha-Joon Chang in Cambridge, I might have mentioned this before, he complains that at Cambridge, the whole department has been taken over by mathematicians. And basically what they're teaching is junk. And we need to move away from that mathematical side of things, all this drawing graphs and curves and seeing where the different lines intersect and so on. It doesn't mean anything. It looks great in a textbook. It's easy to test in an exam, but actually it ignores all of the qualitative things in the real world. And when I'm talking about the qualitative things in the real world, we've mentioned a few of them briefly, but it's probably worth reiterating. You know, we're talking about bribery, corruption, influencing politicians by funding their elections, taking control of the regulator, revolving doors, and so on. None of this exists in mainstream economics teaching. Neither does advertising. Neither does the financial system. Bizarrely, how you can teach economics without the financial system is quite staggering. But of course, when people study the real world, they realize that these qualitative factors are the things that dominate. And the quantitative stuff is very much secondary. It's important when you're setting up a business and doing some number crunching and so on, but it's not actually how our societies function.
No, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Rod. Absolutely. It makes so many points, and the trouble is now that going back through them, if they were at the time, I was thinking,
yeah,
you know, this is something I really do. Oh, interesting as well. One of the authors that you didn't mention, but something I think we should mention to the readers is Naomi Klein, because of her work on disaster capitalism, and she explains brilliantly how the disasters are created and then exploited by the very wealthy, and the people who carry all the cost are us, the public.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think Naomi Klein's book is a great explanation of many of the things that go on, and in fact, it ties in very closely, let's say, with the Russia example that I talked about. So when the Berlin Wall collapses, that is this huge shock to the system, and suddenly the country is in chaos, and bizarre policies can get enacted and have really dramatic consequences, which might work for the rich but not for the poor. And Naomi Klein's documented that that has happened in country after country. And the American government and the British government and other advanced nations understand how to capitalize on these situations. And big companies are set up to work out how to capitalize on these disasters or on these shocks and so on. And so we've now created a system where you've got a lot of people looking to take advantage anytime there is anything unfortunate going on, whether that's war, natural disaster, destabilization, and so on. There's some very powerful players looking to take advantage.
Absolutely. And you think how cynical that is, and what a cynical culture it creates. And these very cynical people, what they actually are sympathetic towards in terms of economic ideologies, should make us very worried. And of course, Naomi Klein herself, I think she crossed the threshold in terms of writing disaster capitalism after the hurricane in New Orleans, and how the big corporations were already there. They're all waiting for this to happen and to go in and take their piece and to excuse my language, sod the rest of us. It was about that manipulation for their own interests. Absolutely, it's just horrendous, you know. And for so many people, of course, they're just not aware of it or unable to actually respond to it.
I think it's really good that you've highlighted the cynicism of so many powerful people. There seem to be, it's not just politicians and corporate executives, but you've got whole armies of lawyers, financial advisors, lobbyists, public relations people, advertising executives, an enormous swathe of the most successful people in our societies. When you actually look at what they do in their day jobs, it is incredibly unethical, and frequently it's criminal. And yet there is no serious discussion about this.
Yes, absolutely. Just final 2 points. And again, this is another example of cynicism. But I remember when I was growing up, and the general feeling, now it might have been based on prejudice, I don't know, but the general feeling was that when you bought a Japanese car, for example, a Datsun, it was prone to rust. And a lot of consumers used to say that it was intentional, that they didn't create the car with alloys and metals in such a way as to make sure that it had a 25-year lifespan. in actual fact, we wanted it to rust, so the consumer was constantly having to replace. And
so
sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, so I've never studied the early Japanese sort of car market, and it's definitely the case, and I think we have talked about this on an earlier show, that manufacturers can be quite cynical in terms of trying to exploit the public by finding ways to add on costs later on, or hidden charges, and so on. And so the idea of making products that don't last very long, or their usable lifespan is very short, is a deliberate part of many companies. I'd have to do some research to see to what extent that was the case, let's say with Datsun. So my recollection is that prior to about the 1980s in the UK, rust was a fairly standard issue across almost all cars, and then suddenly there was this kind of step change in car reliability.
Yes.
And the ability to withstand rust, and their durability and so on. So you saw far fewer cars breaking down at the side of the motorway a sort of decade later and so on. So I have a feeling with the Japanese cars, it was simply that early on they were probably replicating the earlier generation of technologies that Britain, America, and Europe had been using, whereas the wealthier, more technologically advanced car companies had already started to move into an era of using more advanced production processes. So it may not have been deliberate on the part of the car company Datsun, but I'd have to research it to see.
No, they're fair dues, Rod. And I think it's also to do, again, with propaganda, because firstly, if you are brought up to trust in your nation state, so let's talk about Britain here, then the protection, for example, of anything that came off production like the British Leyland. But hey, let's not go there. Let's go to Japan. They were one of our foes in the World War II, so they're an easy target. Okay, so absolutely supports your point. But also when it comes to that process of privatization and saying, oh, British Leyland, it's not good in the state hands, it needs to be in private hands. That's when the propaganda shifts and starts to pick at British Leyland.
Yeah.
So that the consumer starts to question, and they probably need a new approach, a new economic model to make it better.
Yeah, so that may well be true. So I think once you start looking at the sort of technology changes over the years and so on, the motivations of the different actors behind the scenes are all quite interesting. I often wonder with the Japanese cars if there is a different ethos in the Japanese population in general. So over in Britain and America, we rich and powerful people who own car companies see it as perfectly acceptable to deliberately engineer things in a way they'll fall apart. You need to replace them in a couple of years, new phone, new computer, whatever. It wouldn't surprise me if in some countries, and maybe Japan, but we'd have to study it, they have a different sense of pride in the things that they produce. And they might actually want to engineer them to be the best they can possibly be. But I don't know. It's what I did notice over the years in reading lots of Which magazines and their car reliability surveys is that for many, many years, it's been Japanese car companies that have been head and shoulders more reliable than manufacturers from other countries. And that one of the things I talk about when I'm talking about corporate crime is I focus on Britain and America and stuff because those are the companies that we're most familiar with. But it may well be that you could live in a population that has an entirely different culture of what is right and what is wrong and what ethics means, and that you can actually have a corporate system where ethics matters, and they won't go about exploiting their staff and their suppliers and their customers and trying to rip people off and so on. That actually a corporate system within an ethical framework might actually work. But without studying these other countries in much more detail, it would be hard to say.
Yeah, and I think also we probably need to do some research into, and again, based on the premise that we're moving away from the state control into the passing responsibility onto the individual, with the corporations taking over much more of that control mechanism. And I don't know if you've noticed this, Rob, but probably in the last 10 to 15 years, the way in which phone calls are increasing to households, pushing on them insurance for their white goods. So a lot of people now, for example, are insuring up to, let's say, 8 white goods in their house. They're paying out however much a month annually. And the insurance companies are raking it in, because if, like you say, we are now manufacturing, producing goods that have a lot longer life expectancy, it means for the insurance companies, they're raking it in, because these people are insuring something for literally nothing. They're insuring something that won't go wrong probably for 7 or 8 years, let's say. And how much money have they paid out in that time? Probably the same amount as all the eight white products that they insured.
Right, so I think that's a good point. So I often talk about whole industries that are not fit for purpose. So banking and pharmaceuticals we've mentioned before. But I think there are also major problems with the whole industry in insurance. And I was having a chat with Chris Williamson some while ago, doing a similar sort of presentation. And he actually raised the question, would we be better off without insurance companies at all, that you'd actually do insurance through the state? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. I mean, I think if you debated it, you might not necessarily come to the same conclusion that he does. But I think there are question marks to be asked about the way insurance companies work. And one of the things that I thought was worth highlighting when I was discussing that with him was that it's really important to question things that we take for granted, like the existence of insurance companies. Absolutely. And the example that always sticks in my mind is about how fire brigades used to operate, that we didn't used to have fire brigades. We used to have private fire tenders where people had insurance with private companies. And this is where the term fire sale comes from, that if you didn't have insurance, your property could burn down and nobody was there to put your fire out. And if you had insurance with the wrong fire company and their fire tenders happen to be busy at any given moment, then the other companies would not come to your aid and so on. And then eventually nations that I describe as advanced nations, so they all realized actually the sensible thing is to have a state-run fire brigade and to eliminate the concept of fire insurance and so on. And I think it's worth looking at that in every area of the economy and say, actually, maybe we don't need other types of insurance too. Maybe it would be better for the state to cover the possibility that your house gets flooded or a gas leak blows, destroys your house and so on. So I think there's all sorts of debates, but again, most people are not really having at all, because most things that are taken for granted, we never question. And yet we need to be continually questioning everything all the time.
Absolutely. And it comes back, I've got one more point, but it comes back to where we started. It's not just about free trade versus properly regulated trade for the state. It's also now becoming increasingly about free trade or properly regulated trade for the individual, because we are the consumers, individually the consumers. And the interesting thing also, I think, is you broached this within the presentation, is that we get a lot of people saying, oh, isn't it a shame that our town centres are turning into, ghettos and ghost towns, and shops are all boarded up. And yet so many of those same people who make this huge noise buy most of what they buy from places like Amazon. And they can't quite understand. I mean, don't get me wrong, some people purposely choose not to go anywhere near Amazon. But you do get those people saying, oh, I walk through town, it's a dreadful state, it's a dreadful place, I try and avoid it now. And yet they are, if they're buying their stuff from Amazon or places like Amazon, they are part of the causation. And they have to recognize that if they want things to change.
Absolutely. So I agree entirely. And I think it's a subject that, you'd have to have a whole program to discuss it properly. But so there's a real issue that many of the new technologies, so Amazon is the classic example, to buy something, once you've got the system set up and running, it's just one click. Yes. And that is so easy and so convenient that an awful lot of people whose lives are very stressful, they feel they don't have time, the kids are screaming in the background, you just want to click the mouse and then get on with the rest of your life. And I think we need to have a huge discussion about the consequences of that system and its impacts and so on. That if you were living a life that was not so stressful all the time, then people might make different decisions. And so you start examining the bigger picture. Well, why are our lives so stressful? Well, as you say, a lot of decisions that people didn't have to make in the past have been offloaded onto us. So in fact, I often think that the school example is the great example. When I was young, you just went to the nearest school. And what you wanted was the state to make sure that all schools were reasonable. Now we have lots and lots of school choice. Well, in making the choice, you spend hundreds of hours doing research. And then a lot of the time, you'll make a decision to take your child to a school that's not the local one, which is just down the road. You're taking one that's a mile away, or a bus journey, or a train journey away. And so we've made our lives much more complex, and the government has participated in making our lives much more complex. And so we need to have this huge sort of discussion about why it is that we're now living in one of the wealthiest societies in history, but most people feel more stressed, more miserable, much less happy than many people were in the past. And we have to question, why are we heading in this direction in so many different ways? And so I think that's this great debate that we've got to start to have.
I think it's probably because we've replaced need with want.
Yes, I think there's a great deal of that, very much so.
And I think if you go back in time, I used to use this particular case study when I'm teaching the sociology of work. And for those people working in mines, in the winter, because they had to leave the house so early and they came back so late, they didn't see any daylight between Sunday afternoon and Saturday morning, because they went to work in the dark and they came home in the dark, and they came back to a basic place of living, which they were used to. That was their norm. So they weren't craving white goods because that wasn't part of their consciousness. But now, and we talk about stressful societies, I mean, living down a hole for the best part of a week must be fairly stressful. Of course you normalize, but it's dangerous, it's dirty, it affects how long you live and how you get old. And yet we talk about the stressful society in which we have now, absolutely, because the individual has become so-called more empowered and therefore has many more decisions to have to make. But we almost like, it's that therapy thing, isn't it? We almost like to keep bombarding people with the idea that their lives are stressful. And then especially in America, the middle class is spending billions every year on sitting in front of somebody and offloading, yet nothing changes. Yeah. And this is why we sort of finished off this particular session today, just with a question, Rod. What can the public do in terms of taking on corporations? I mean, obviously suing them becomes a massive problem because they haven't got the resources, unless they create a whole group of people and they crowdfund or whatever. So just it's a positive last step, really. What can individuals do who are being exploited and are being conditioned and wholly determined by CEOs and shareholders and something inanimate somewhere else?
Well, so I think that's a great question, and I've often wondered about it over the years. And I thought, oh no, he's asked for a positive final step. I'm often not that positive in these things. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is people will protest against a specific individual company for wrongdoing. And now that might have some short-term effect, but what we see in the grand scheme of things is it's making no difference. And once the company has employed a few PR people to whitewash things and people forget about it and then they move on, then actually most things revert to how they were and so on. So we actually require change at the political level. So it's a kind of, firstly, it's an awareness thing. So we've got to get everybody understanding the criminal and unethical nature of big companies, but then we have to get the debate to policymakers, and we have to find ways to make sure that our voices, so that's the masses of the population who want companies to change the way they behave, we have to get our voices heard more than politicians are listening to the voices of the rich and the powerful. And that's an incredibly difficult job, because the rich and the powerful are funding them and they have a vested interest in helping them. And so it requires that we start saying corporate activities, corporate crimes, corporate unethical activities must be on the agenda of every single politician. Because you have to remember that a great many politicians won't even know that this is a major issue, that quite a lot of them buy into the kind of academic mindset that let's focus on corporate profit. So we've got to make it an issue. So we have to go and talk to politicians, and we have to talk as widely as we can. We have to go and talk to academics, and we have to start to change the narrative and so on. So it's something that's going to require everyone to try and get involved as much as they can in discussing these things as widely as possible. So fingers crossed, but it's going to take a while.
Yes. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Rod. Thank you so much. Again, unbelievable content, unbelievable detail and analysis, and hopefully the readers, watchers will be able to extract it and share it, and please subscribe to our channel, and hopefully in the future, we can build upon a lot of the points that you've made. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week, Rod.
Thanks for having me on again. Yeah, see you next week, everybody.